What happens when human interpretation overshadows divine guidance? In today's deep dive, based on Chapter 7 of Zafarullah Khan's Islam and the Contemporary World, we unpack the distinction between Quranic authority and man-made jurisprudence and why reclaiming this balance is essential for meaningful reform in the Muslim world.
That's exactly it. This chapter, Zafarullah Khan's work, it really focuses on the current state of things in the Muslim world. It looks at some really serious stuff: exploitation, poverty, even terror.
Yeah.
And the author's main point really is that a huge part of the problem is this feeling of being, well, kind of stuck in the past, failing to build a truly Islamic modern existence.
And he says it's down to a lack of real ijtihad, that independent reasoning based on the sources.
Precisely. A lack of genuine ijtihad. That's his diagnosis.
Okay, so our mission today really is to get into that argument, to understand what the source sees as this critical difference between the authentic sources of Islam and all the human interpretations that came later.
Yeah.
And importantly, what happens, for you listening when those lines get blurred.
Absolutely. So the source kicks things off by identifying what it considers the only two authentic sources in Islam.
Well, sure.
The Quran and the Sunnah. Simple as that. The Quran, it says, is the final revealed book. It's meant for everyone, everywhere, for all time.
The ultimate guidance.
Yeah, the source even points to verses saying it's a blessing and a guide to mankind, with clear signs.
And it also highlights that the Quran repeatedly tells followers to obey Allah and the messenger, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Right, that connection is key. It shows the prophet's role isn't just delivering the message, but also living it, explaining it.
Which brings us to the second source.
A sunnah.
Yeah.
Exactly. The prophet's way of life, his practices, his sayings. The source mentions that well-known hadith where the prophet says he left two things.
The Book of Allah and his Sunnah.
That's the one. Hold on to them and you won't go astray. That's the foundation laid out in the source.
So, Quran and Sunnah, the bedrock. But what I found really striking in the source material was what the earliest scholars, the big names, the imams, what they said about their own opinions compared to those two sources.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe highlights where things went differently later on, according to Khan. Take Imam Abu Hanifa.
Okay.
He reportedly said, quite directly, if something he said contradicts the Quran or the Prophet's saying, or even a companion's saying, just leave it. Ignore his opinion.
Wow. So don't follow me, follow the evidence.
Pretty much. He said his whole method, his madhab, was just based on whatever authentic hadith he found.
That's quite humble, really.
It is. And Imam Malik ibn Anas, he had that famous line, any person saying can be accepted or rejected.
Except the prophets.
Except the prophets, peace be upon him, yeah. He even told people, check my views against the Quran and Sunnah. If they match, fine. If not, we'll reject them.
And the story about Imam Shafi getting angry.
Oh, yeah. Someone asked him if he agreed with a hadith he just narrated.
His opinion mattered more than the prophet's.
Exactly. And he was apparently furious. His point was, look, if I'm narrating it, of course I hold by it. It's not about my stamp of approval. It's about the source itself.
It really puts the focus back where it belongs, according to them.
Totally. And Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal said something similar. Don't just blindly follow me or Malik or Shafi. Go back to where we took it from.
Meaning the Quran and the authentic Sunnah.
Right. Take from the source directly.
So these foundational figures were essentially warning against treating their interpretations as, the final word.
That's the strong implication in the source, yes. And the argument is that later on, maybe that distinction got lost, and human reasoning started getting treated almost like divine text itself.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into these two crucial terms the source says get mixed up all the time. Shariah and Fiqh. How does Khan define them?
Well, the source defines Shariah not just as, laws and punishments, but more broadly, like the way, the method, the path to follow.
The source mentions the literal meaning, right? Like a path to water.
Exactly, like a clear road to a vital source. It represents the divine law, the core guidance.
So it's the stuff directly from the Quran and the authentic Sunnah.
Yes, that's Shariah, according to this perspective. And here's the really crucial point the source makes. Shariah doesn't change, because the Quran and Sunnah don't change.
What's allowed is allowed, what's forbidden is forbidden, like murder, for example.
Right. That core moral and legal framework is constant. That's Shariah.
Okay, clear. So if Shariah is the unchanging divine path, what's Fiqh then?
Fiqh literally translates to true understanding. But in this context, the source explains it as the body of, explanations, interpretations, rulings, fatwas, and judgments that scholars developed over centuries.
Ah, so it's the human effort to understand and apply the Shariah.
Precisely. It's derived from Shariah, but it's not Shariah itself. It's indirect, based on reasoning and deduction to address specific situations that might not be explicitly detailed in the Quran or Sunnah.
And the source stresses, Fiqh doesn't override Shariah.
Never. It's meant for issues not directly covered. The example used is smoking tobacco. It's not mentioned in the Quran or Sunnah.
Right.
So scholars looked at broader Shariah principles, like the verse, "Do not kill yourselves," meaning don't harm yourselves, and used fiqh, their understanding, to rule on it, often saying it's disliked or even forbidden because of the health risks.
Okay, that makes sense. Shariah is the foundation. Fiqh is the structure built upon it, the application.
Good way to put it. And because fiqh is that human structure, that application, it can change.
Unlike Shariah.
Right. Fiqh can evolve based on new knowledge, different circumstances, changing societies. The source even notes Imam Shafi himself adjusted some of his fiqh rulings when he moved from Iraq to Egypt because the context was different.
So Shariah, broad, general, timeless, fiqh, specific, contextual, potentially changeable, derived from Shariah.
You've got it. That's the distinction the source emphasizes.
So if it's laid out that clearly, where, according to Khan, did things go wrong? What's the problem?
The problem, the source argues quite forcefully, is that these two concepts, Shariah and fiqh, got confused, muddled together. And crucially, people started giving more weight, more authority to fiqh, the human interpretation.
So when people today call for implementing Shariah, the source is saying they often actually mean implementing specific historical fiqh rulings.
That's exactly the point Khan makes. They mistake these human-developed, time and place specific interpretations for the eternal divine law itself.
And treat those fiqh rules as sacred and unchangeable.
Yes, as if they are the divine obstacles to any new thinking or adaptation, rather than recognizing them as products of human reasoning in a particular context.
The very existence of different schools of fiqh, Hanafi, Maliki, and so on kind of proves that point, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They generally agree on the Shariah from Quran and Sunnah.
On the core principles.
But their fiqh, their interpretations and applications, differ.
Absolutely. That diversity itself shows it's human intellectual work, not a single monolithic divine command on every detail.
Okay, so what happens when this confusion sets in? When fiqh gets prioritized and, as the source suggests, the Quran gets sidelined, what are the consequences?
Well, one major consequence highlighted is losing connection with the most protected source. The source mentions that verse where Allah guarantees the preservation of the Quran.
Right, Quran 15.10.
Yeah. But no such explicit divine guarantee exists for, say, collections of hadith, let alone books of fiqh, which suggests, the Quran should have ultimate primacy.
But the source says the reality is often the opposite. The Quran gets neglected.
That's the argument, that fiqh gets far more attention. The source brings in quotes from the poet-philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, writing way back in 1918.
What did he say?
He lamented, basically, "You are degraded and humiliated as you have ignored the Quran. The movement of time has left you behind, and you just complain about it." A pretty stark warning.
And Iqbal was critical of the jurists, too, wasn't he?
Very critical. There's another quote from 1936 where he says, "The misguided Muslim jurists do not change themselves. Rather, they change the Quran." He accused them of being rigid, lacking innovation, sort of twisting the source to fit their existing frameworks rather than letting the source challenge them.
So this overemphasis on fiqh leads to a kind of legalism, narrowing the view of Islam.
Exactly. The source contends that the vast moral, social, spiritual dimensions of Islam, which are so central to the Quran, get pushed aside in favor of focusing on tiny details of legal rulings.
Like the example about prayer.
Yeah, spending more energy debating the precise way to stand or place your hands, the fiqh details, than on cultivating the actual purpose of prayer, which is connection with Allah, presence, the spiritual core.
And the source claims this imbalance is even reflected in religious education. More fiqh than Quran study.
Yes, that Matadors, traditional schools, often teach fiqh hundreds of times more than the Quran itself, leading to far more experts in fiqh, muftis, than deep scholars of the Quran.
It reinforces that cycle.
It does, and Iqbal's quoted again saying something like, "Oh, Muslim, you are chained by the Sufis and mullah. You do not get the life lessons from the Quran," suggesting people are kept from directly engaging with the Quran's guidance.
The author even mentions being told not to study the Quran directly without a teacher, for fear of being misguided.
Yeah, a personal anecdote in the source, which, again, seems counter to the idea of the Quran being clear guidance for all. It fosters dependence on intermediaries and their interpretations rather than direct engagement.
And instead of being a living guide, the Quran sometimes becomes almost like a talisman.
That's the sad consequence the source describes. Using it for amulets or reciting verses ritualistically without internalizing the meaning or acting on the teachings. The analogy used is powerful. It's like wearing a doctor's prescription around your neck instead of taking the medicine.
How can it cure anything if you don't actually take it?
Exactly. How can the Quran address spiritual or societal problems if it's just used as an amulet or recited without understanding and application? Iqbal, again, is quoted, "You do not benefit from the fire of the Quran except that you recite Surah Yasin to ease out the pangs of death."
Reducing its vast guidance to just one specific end-of-life ritual.
Right, instead of it being the blueprint for your whole life.
So given all this, what's the way forward proposed in the source? What's the call for reform?
The conclusion is pretty direct. The source says Muslims need to arise out of deep slumber and reform themselves for a better living. And the way to do that is by consciously returning to the authentic sources.
Back to the Quran and Sunnah.
Yes. And crucially, understanding and maintaining that distinction between the unchangeable divine guidance, the Shariah.
And the changeable human-derived understanding, the Fiqh.
Exactly. It means not letting historical fiqh rulings become sacred cows that block necessary thought, adaptation, and innovation for today's world.
The source seems to suggest that if this clarity had been maintained, Islam could have been a much more dynamic force for progress.
That's the strong implication, that a proper understanding centered on the Quran and Sunnah allows for development and engagement with modernity, rather than seeing them as inherently opposed.
So reform isn't about throwing things away, but about recentering, going back to the core sources to figure out how to live as a Muslim now.
Precisely. Using ijtihad, that informed reasoning based on Quran and Sunnah, to address contemporary challenges rather than being bound solely by interpretations made centuries ago in vastly different contexts. It's about reviving the spirit, not just the letter of past rulings.
So to sum up the source's main thrust, real, meaningful reform requires shifting the focus back from prioritizing human interpretations, Fiqh, to prioritizing the direct divine guidance of the Quran and Sunnah, the Shariah, and using that as the foundation for engaging with the world.
That's the core message, reclaiming that clarity, that direct connection to the sources that the earliest generations seem to emphasize.
Okay, so thinking about this distinction the source draws, if Fiqh really is a product of its specific time and place, and it can change, what questions does that raise for you, listening, about applying rulings from, say, the 9th or 10th century to challenges today like artificial intelligence or global finance or genetic engineering, things those early scholars just couldn't have imagined?
Right? And on the flip side, how does grounding ourselves firmly in the broad, unchanging principles of Shariah actually empower Muslims to innovate and adapt? How does that core stability allow for flexibility in dealing with a constantly changing world while still remaining true to the essential divine guidance?